Do you want to reduce the time that you spend designing dashboards? Do you find yourself doing the same configuration patterns over and over again? Do you wish there was an easier way? Well, do I have a solution for you. It's called Spotfire Application Defaults. Application Defaults is a little known thing in Spotfire, and it's something one might not think of, but it can really speed up your work. So today, I'm going to show you my favorite configurations. Let's jump in. Now to start, we're going to use this Honey Production dashboard. And this is all styled the way I like it, but this is not using the application defaults. In fact, the application defaults looked something more like this. Now I want to point out that what I'm going to show you is the default settings for Spotfire, and it's kind of a baseline from where you want to start. If you're doing one-off styling here and there, then this might not be the right thing for you, but if you're doing a lot of the same patterns, then this is going to be perfect for you. You can find the application defaults in Tools and Options. Here you'll see various settings for the applications, the visualizations, the charts, the document, and there's a lot going on here, so I'm just going to show you some of my favorites. I'm going to start with fonts, and fonts for different charts can be very tedious if you try to change them all individually, but if you're using the same fonts over and over, this is a great place to set them once and for all and never have to keep redoing that every time you create new charts. The next thing I want to point out is the document. If you use a dark theme often, you can start with that. You can also set filter settings and details on the demand, the panel settings, all right here. Below, there's the page navigation settings, and one thing I like to change here is the marking color, and I'll show you why in a second. So in marking color, I typically go for something that's just a little bit dark gray, not completely black. And then when I scroll down to the visualization, these are for all the visualizations. If I want the title visible by default, the description visible by default, I usually don't use the descriptions that much, so I turn that off. And when I go down here, you can see the default fixed color. So for this, I can choose, let's say, green, and this is going to be the default color for my chart. So rather than this blue that you're seeing, it will start as green. Now with my Honey Production theme, you can see all these different colors I'm using. I have a categorical theme here. I also have a continuous theme here. And you can go into the settings for each of these, and you can actually save these to the library or save them as a file. You can save it to the document. It's something we'll talk about a little bit later. I just want to point out that you can save those somewhere. Now coming back into this other dashboard where I'm saying the defaults, I can actually set this by opening from the library my categorical theme, and I can open from the library and set my continuous theme. All right, those are my two Honey Production ones. Another thing I like to change is when I create a details visualization, I like to show all the data. I don't like it to be an empty visualization. So I'm going to change this to all the data, and I have my preferred aggregation method set to average. In some of the older versions of Spotfire, this is set to sum, but I find average gives me better AI recommendations, and it's typically what I'm using more when I'm looking at trends in my data. Now you can also go into the axis formatting, and this is great for formatting the number types that you're using. Let's say you're working in a scientific environment where you're using 6 decimal points of precision, and Spotfire is always putting in like maybe 3 or 2. You can set that right here by going into the number settings, setting the decimals. You can change the short number format, things like that. So that's also another nice quick tip. For all the other visualizations, I typically just turn off legends by default. A lot of people like to have everything on there all at once, and then they remove what they don't need. I like to go the other way where it shows as little as possible, and then I slowly add what I want after that. So turning off legends by default is something that's useful. I'm not going to do this for each of these. I think it'd be a little too tedious. I'm just going to jump right to the map chart. There's a lot more to talk about here with the map chart, and it's one of my favorite defaults to set. So looking at the different options here, I usually leave all of these controls on, the navigation controls, all of those settings. I like all of those on. If you are working somewhere where you're using different coordinate reference systems, it's a great place to set the defaults here. And then one of my favorite parts is this default layer area. Now, in a previous video, we showed how to do custom TMS and WMS layers for custom map backgrounds, and it can be tedious to go find those, copy and paste them, and add them each time. So what I do is I add them all in up front here, and then when I'm building a chart and I don't need certain layers, I just remove them. It's a lot easier to remove them later. So if you look at this community page on TMS and WMS layers that I've shown in the past, you'll find different layers. I often use a gray theme if I need to just highlight my data and I just want some basic reference points. One thing I really like to put in is the satellite imagery. So I'm gonna grab that URL. And here I'm gonna add in a map layer and I'm gonna add a TMS layer. And I'm gonna call this satellite. And I'll put in the URL, you can put in the copyright text, however you need it. That's all included in this community page. Another thing I haven't added to that community page yet, but I wanted to point out is the Google Maps layers. I really like the terrain layer, and so I'm gonna grab this, and I'm gonna add that in as well as a TMS layer. All right. Okay, so now I have these layers in. I just want to point out that you can add a feature layer from your library. If you are working somewhere where maybe you have some sales regions that are drawn in geometries, or you have pipelines or railroads or some other type of geometries or points, you can actually bring that in by default every time by connecting this to a feature layer in your library. So I don't have that set up here, but I just wanted to point it out. You can also, do simple things like their units and change the default fixed color, stuff like that. And I think that pretty much takes me through most of what I wanted to show you here. So now I'm going to hit OK, and let's create some charts and see what happens. Here, I'm going to just create a map chart. And by default, we see that this is very different than the Spotfire defaults. The Spotfire default map looks a little more like this. And I have the satellite layer that's right in there, and this terrain layer, which is the Google Maps layer. Let me search for Seattle here, where I'm based. Seattle. And as I zoom in on the city, I can actually see these reference points from Google Maps. And these are not actually clickable, so I'm not able to click these, but they are rendered in the background for you. Now, the honey production data is all drawn as points, and the markers are green because that was my default color. Let me show you something else here. If you go into your options and you go into your map chart and you select this as a default feature layer, then by default, every time you add a layer, it'll be the geometry. So let me do this again, and I'll draw a map chart. And this is now the geometries. And the color theme that was brought in is the continuous color theme that was from my honeybee data. So that was the ones that we imported from the library as a continuous theme. Now, just a couple more things and we can wrap this up. I'm going to drop in a line chart here, and you'll see that this green line is in. The default visualization color is that green. The legend is off by default. I'll open this up. I'll line this by the different states, so each line represents a different state, and I'll color this by, let's say, my total production. So now that continuous theme is applied here, the darker values being the higher numerical values, and that default aggregation of average is included here. Now, I want to point out that this will be applied, these configurations will be applied every time you open up Spotfire on every new analysis. So it's not just this one DXP I'm working with. The one thing that is not going to change in this particular DXP is the marking color, because it was already set when I started changing the application defaults. So let me show you why that matters. In File and Document Properties, you'll see that this marking is yellow. Again, that was set before I changed the defaults in this DXP, but in the future ones, it'll be this gray color that I had selected that I wanted. And the marking color, so if you select if you mark some data, the other rows will all be kind of faded out, the other parts of the visualization, but you can actually go into Properties, Appearance, and use a separate color for marked values, and then that marking color is used for whatever you're marking. So So that's pretty much it for today's quick tip. It's super simple. It's a super easy way to streamline your design process. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and keep getting more tips every week. Thanks.